And so those words, gender identity disorder and gender dysphoria, maybe we should start with defining what are they? What does that mean?
So, according to the DSM-5, so our current diagnostic manual,
Mhm.
describes three separate pathways to gender dysphoria. So one being the childhood onset type that I experienced, which is highly correlated with homosexuality. There are sorry, I'll get to the second one in a minute. So
Sure.
that type. So there's one pathway of that early childhood onset, especially in the boys. It's very almost guaranteed that those boys will end up being same sex attracted. The girls, there's still a strong correlation with homosexuality with girls, but it's not as strong as with the boys. There are
Okay.
some heterosexual women that experience childhood gender dysphoria who do outgrow it, but most kids, male or female, with childhood onset gender dysphoria are going to be same sex attracted as adults. So that's one type. The second type is associated with transvestic disorder. People that have sexual arousal to cross dressing, some of those people experienced something called autogynephilia. So beyond just feeling arousal to wearing women's clothing, they also experience arousal to the idea of having a female body. And
Mhm.
that can progress into gender dysphoria, especially later in life. So those boys aren't typically gender nonconforming as children. They're usually very typical heterosexual boys. Often keep that the sexual arousal part a secret. You know, they might try on their mother's clothing in secret when no one's at home, for example. So parents aren't often aware that that's happening, and it tends to, you know, because children aren't overtly sexual, but it tends to intensify in adolescence for those boys. So they might be very typical boys up until adolescence, but when their sexuality kicks in,
Mhm.
those feelings might intensify, and that might at some point later in life progress into gender dysphoria, meaning the strong desire to actually become women.
Mhm.
And then the third type, which is very rare, is related to intersex conditions. There are a handful of, because there's many different kinds of intersex conditions, and not all intersex people experience this, but there are some intersex conditions where gender dysphoria tends to be more common. It's mostly the natal females that were exposed to too much testosterone during fetal development may kind of have this strong sense of I was assigned wrong
Mhm.
at birth. So that's my understanding of gender dysphoria, those three separate pathways.
So, using the words gender dysphoria, well, to me, it has medical implications, or it implies it has medical connotations. That's what I'm looking for. And so, I suppose some people would maybe say that that's wrong to say that it's a medical condition or it's anything. It's a psychological condition. Some people would say no, it's just that they were born in the wrong body and that they are a woman or they are a man. So I suppose what would you say to that argument?
Well, I do think it's a condition of some kind. I think there's
Mhm.
still a lot not understood about it. You know, whether
Mhm.
there is something neurologically different about us, whether it is like a mental health condition, I don't. I think there's still a lot of question marks about what causes it and what is it.
Mhm.
I'm leaning towards the developmental model of it. I think it's a part of the psychological development of gay and lesbian people in terms of the childhood aspect of it. Because most people with childhood gender dysphoria do outgrow it. So if it was like a wired in mechanism, I wouldn't think that it would be possible to for someone to outgrow it. But what psychologists who developmental psychologists like Dr. Zucker, for example, who used to run a clinic back in the 70s and 80s and 90s into the early 2000s, he felt that if you catch it early enough in childhood, you can kind of help it to desist before it really solidifies into a stable, concrete identity. But he feels, and as many psychologists do, that if it persists into adolescence and early adulthood, the chances of it desisting at that point is unlikely because it's a solidified sense of self. And undoing that at that point could, I think, could potentially do psychological harm.